Hello, and welcome to Economy Disrupted, our regular live webcast of forces that are disrupting the U.S. and global economies. I'm Matthew Goodman, Senior Vice President in the CSIS Economics Program. Delighted to have you with us. This week, we're going to look at the shakeup in higher education, and we have a terrific guest with us. While you're watching, you can submit questions at the link that should be on the screen below us. So with that, over to Stephanie.
I'm Stephanie Siegel, Senior Fellow with the Economics Program at CSIS and co-host of Economy Disrupted. Thanks for joining us today for episode 8. We've got about 45 minutes with our guest, and then we're going to wrap up with a short segment called The Bottom Line, so hopefully you can stay with us for the duration. For today's guest, we're very happy to be joined by Mary Sue Coleman, former president of the Association of American Universities, or AAU, President Emerita of the University of Michigan, and former president of the University of Iowa. Time magazine named her as one of the nation's 10 best college presidents. The American Council on Education honored her with its Lifetime Achievement Award in 2014. So when we looked at doing an episode on this topic, we really could have asked for no better guest to join us than Mary Sue. So thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
So let me just start off with kind of the obvious question, I think, given the headlines that everyone's reading, the concerns that many parents and students have about their near-term plans for college, and that's purely the disruption that's being posed by the pandemic and how universities and colleges are responding. So just an initial question here, how you see the pandemic impacting universities' abilities to deliver on their education and research mandates. And also, I realize that this is a very diverse set of institutions that we're talking about, but have you seen certain models or practices that seem to be more effective in dealing with this pandemic?
Sure. Thanks, Stephanie. The pandemic has created the kind of disruption that I haven't seen in my lifetime. And I think, most people have not experienced this kind of an event that has caused so much sort of angst for students. I think for faculty as well, for staff. So this is really a difficult time for all institutions. There are also geographic differences. And so I think it's hard to say I've seen a model that might work everywhere because I just think that's unrealistic. In fact, I just saw this morning that the California state system has decided to continue virtual even into the spring of 2021. I think they're trying to be realistic about what their situation is and what they can do. Many other institutions have decided to delay their start, hoping that they could get some monitoring in place, making sure that students have been tested for COVID before they come. Some institutions have used that strategy. Others are using a hybrid model to try to de-densify. I know some of the Ivies have decided that, certain classes like the freshmen can come, the juniors have to stay online. I think everybody is trying very, very hard to accommodate. Unfortunately, what we have seen at most institutions that have opened up for in-person classes, spikes in cases. And there's some that are very concerning. I just saw this morning that an institution in Georgia, one of the public institutions, have 10% of their students that are now testing positive for COVID or have been seen by their health services being ill. So those kinds of numbers are really, really concerning. And I think even though institutions are doing a variable job in trying to warn their students about activities and behaviors, mask wearing, I think mask wearing obviously helps. We are just in a situation where I think most institutions are trying to find their way. And of course, this has been a devastating financial consequence for universities.
Well, and actually, I feel like we could do an entire episode just on this issue, but there's too much for us to get to. But I want to follow up on the financial link.
Yes.
And one of the themes throughout our series have been looking at issues that were there prior to the pandemic, but COVID has really served as an accelerant. And the move to online education is one of those themes that's kind of been there in higher education that COVID has now really kind of accelerated.
Yes.
But there's, I guess, the possibility and even the risk that that sort of shift to online learning, non-resident learning, is something that is more permanent post-pandemic. And what might that mean then for the business model, so to speak, of US universities?
Sure, I think that's a really interesting question. And we're in a period where I think we'll find out. I mean, prior to the pandemic, I would say that online education had a niche place in higher education. Certainly for some people who want to extend their expertise and get degrees or get certifications, who have full-time jobs, that online learning was a great boon for them. For undergraduates, though, who want the experience of coming to a university campus and, it's this in-person sort of collaborations and things that happen in the classroom when you're together and with your friends, and you're doing activities outside the sort of traditional classroom setting that many people, young people in the age cohort, the 18 to 22-year-olds really value, and I think is extremely valuable educationally. So I was never a believer that online learning would just sweep away higher education. I think it has a place, it has an important place, and it's been probably used somewhat effectively, maybe now because of the pandemic. There will be new research and new ideas about the way to deliver this online education that are improved. What we got back in sort of listening to students is that they really, particularly undergraduates, don't really like the online format. They don't like sitting in their bedroom all day looking at a computer screen. And I understand that. I think that there's some limitations, but there clearly are probably strategies and mechanisms that could be developed that would really help it a lot. And I think we'll see some of those innovations as a consequence of what we're experiencing now.
I think there's, I have a bunch of people and screens on my house that can also verify your data point there on students used or that. But Matt.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot more to cover there, but let me, if I could, shift gears, and we hopefully can get back to those issues. Sure. But there's a bunch of other things we'd like to talk to you about if we could. Mm-hmm. So one of them is about the decline in research and development spending yes. in the United States. We're at a sort of 60-year low, I think, pre-Sputnik levels now. And the question is sort of why has that happened, and why does it matter, and what should be done about it? Oh, by the way, I should say that one reason we're particularly interested in that is we've been doing a lot of work on innovation in the United States and the edge that the U.S. has traditionally had, and whether we're losing that edge. And this piece of the story seems to be so critical, federal funding for R&D and what universities are doing in that regard. So appreciate that.
Matthew, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because we have been extremely alarmed, sort of particularly the AAU, looking at that decline in expenditures as a percentage of the GDP of the country. And, one of the things we learned during World War II is investment in research helped win the war. I mean, we understood that. And the post-war period, there was tremendous investment, and particularly post-Sputnik, because all of a sudden the US woke up and realized that other countries could outdo us in terms of space exploration. That was the example. So there was a huge ramp up. There was the development of the National Science Foundation. There was the genesis of the National Institutes of Health. And those federal expenditures have brought great benefit to our country, to the quality of life, to the health, to our ability to innovate, and our ability to continue making discoveries that drive economic success as well as quality of life success. So we are alarmed about that. I we advocate, one of the main purposes of AAU is to advocate for sufficient research expenditure. When we look at areas like AI, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, these are areas with other countries, and particularly China, are vastly outspending us in terms of their investment. And we're worried about that. I know that the leaders of NSF and NIH and DOD, Department of Energy, are on the Hill talking about this necessity. And I know that our university leaders are talking too. So I hope that as a consequence, one of the perhaps silver linings of the pandemic is that we as a country will wake up and realize that we cannot afford to lose any more ground in terms of our ability to innovate.
We had Rob Atkinson from the technology the Information Technology Foundation on last week, I think it was, and he's made the point that the U.S. is still leading in basic research. But when it comes to taking that research and applying it and then taking it to the market and commercializing it, we're losing ground, and others are better at that. First of all, can you just explain to the layman like me, what's the difference between basic and applied research? And then again, how do universities play in this game, and how do you get with the private sector to get stuff commercialized, or do you do that? And what's the federal government's role in all of this as well?
Sure. I think that one of the best ways to describe fundamental research is curiosity-driven research. That is, you find a problem, you work on it, you don't have any idea when you start your research what might be the end result. We can have lots of examples of curiosity-driven research that has led to great breakthroughs, like the development of penicillin. Nobody knew penicillin was even possible. And, somebody was looking at a plate of mold and discovered, oh, it's killing the bacteria. I wonder what that means. So penicillin was discovered. That's a quintessential example of what it is. I think my experience at both Iowa and at Michigan was that during the period, particularly of the early 2000s, that there was a tremendous interest, I think, across the country, particularly at research-intensive universities, to really enhance their technology transfer. That is, they had all these discoveries that were being made. They understood and began to understand that you could patent some of these discoveries, or you could license some of these discoveries. And so for commercial use. So what I saw during that period is the real growth of technology transfer offices within university, bringing in expertise, people who understood intellectual property, protection of intellectual property, licensing. And then during that period, this last 15 years particularly, there's been my experience was much more outreach between university researchers and companies to see how they might have similar interests and how they might develop those properties. Now, what a corporation does, or for-profit company, is often going to be very different from what a university does. But I think there's an intersection between the two, and I was delighted to see more conversation so that people could figure out how to get those developments to market. And it's something that we need to continue to develop.
Excellent. Yep. No, a really important set of issues there as well. But Stephanie?
Well, I want to, link that investment in basic research and research and development to another necessary investment, which is in STEM and education. So STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I know that you personally, and also during your tenure as president of AAU, did a lot of work seeking to improve undergraduate STEM education, looking beyond just individual classrooms and thinking about kind of the systems that can facilitate improvements in STEM education. As you and Matt were just talking about, the US economy is an innovation leader, but we still fall very short in terms of graduating STEM, both undergrad and graduate students. Mm-hmm. And so just a basic question is what accounts for this disparity? Why do we seem to produce less STEM degrees than other advanced economies?
Sure. I wish I had a simple answer to that question because I think it's an extraordinarily important one. And we started our STEM education project, undergraduate education project at AAU, because we were extremely concerned about the way that the sciences were being taught, and particularly the undergraduate courses in chemistry, physics, biology that most students at universities have to take. But what we discovered was that the way that education was delivered was not necessarily engaging and was particularly off-putting for women students and for underrepresented minority students. That, the traditions hadn't really changed about engaging students in the dialogue in the classroom. These are usually large classes because for the sake of economy, that's the only way that they can be effectively taught in big universities. So we secured funding and we had pilot projects at a number of institutions to change the engagement, to change the way that students, to really look at effective teaching. And we also discovered that, at many universities, there are champions of this engaged teaching that are single professors, and they do their best and they do a really good job. But if you have a single professor in one department, you're not going to achieve lasting change. And what we discovered was that the way to achieve change is to engage the entire department. So let's say if we wanted to do an introductory chemistry courses, we had to get every single faculty member in that chemistry department to be part of the plan and the pilot and to see it happen. And as a consequence of that, we have created a cohort of interested departments and faculty of, several thousand people who congregate annually to talk about engaged teaching. That's the kind of thing that's going to take for us to get serious about not turning students away and not using those introductory science courses, some of which can be challenging, as weed out courses too. Only the strongest will survive the end of the semester. And, that's not what we want. And I think we know how to do it. It's just getting more and more institutions to agree to use those strategies.
And probably getting the funding to use some of those strategies, because as you said, there's kind of an economy of scale aspect to this issue.
That's right.
I think it's related to that. So we're talking about students once they get to university. Mm-hmm. Do you have, I realize your expertise is not necessarily on kind of primary and secondary education,
sure.
But do you have thoughts on the pipeline of undergraduates, whether or not students are arriving at university with the skills to succeed in those STEM courses?
Sure. I think sadly we have sort of a bimodal distribution in this country in K through 12 education, in places that have sufficient resources, putting a lot of money into their primary and secondary education, you can get some very good results. But a lot of the major urban areas, a lot of the rural areas that don't have the resources, are really struggling. And I don't blame the teachers. I understand that states vary in the amount of money that they're willing to devote to this kind of universal education, which I think is extraordinarily important. So it's variable. I think we have some students who come who are astonishingly well prepared because they've been in a system, not necessarily always a private school. Some of the private schools are good, some of them are not good. Chartered schools, some good, some not so good. I don't think there's just one example here, but I think community engagement in what is happening in the K-12 system is probably one of the most effective ways to improve it, and to have advocates in the state for putting sufficient funding into those systems.
Another really
CSIS
important
Online.
group of
way we bring
people in
you guys
your
is changing,
in
but
universities here in the
we'll
U.S.
still
are
present
foreign
live
students,
analysis
and
and award-winning
in
digital
particular,
media from Metropolis
Chinese. I want to
Ideas
get sort of right to the
all on your
U.S.-China
time,
challenges, because
live or on
those are
demand.
things that obviously are
This is
very
CSIS Online.
hot topic of conversation here in Washington, and we're obviously following a lot of dimensions of this. But the aspect that I want to ask you about is this concern that you have now the Department of Justice and other parts of the federal government that are spending a lot more time, to put it sort of charitably, with universities, looking at issues of research integrity, issues of espionage potentially, and some of that I think is making universities uncomfortable, and obviously students as well. But I wonder, how one of the strengths of our education system, our higher education system, has been its openness and its the benefit that we get from having students from around the world, and including from China. What's the right balance? Because there are risks and there are issues. How do you get this balance right? I know you've written and commented on this before, but I'm interested in, for our audience, your take on that.
Sure, absolutely. I think this in this era is an extremely important point. And one of the things that we discovered, it was part of the last 4 years that have put so much more emphasis on this issue of academic espionage, and what controls universities have in place has really highlighted the issue. Now, we've been here before, and people don't really recall that back in the 90s, we had the export control issue. And so we have, worried about intellectual property theft for a long time at universities. And as a consequence of that earlier period in the 90s, most universities, those that conduct, a lot of research, do have mechanisms in place for checks and balances. One of the things, though, that I think we had lost sight about in the last few years is the importance of disclosure about every source of funding. And, I have this personal experience that I was in a big meeting at a big university, and we were talking about this whole issue of intellectual property. And the audience, those were faculty, were asking me questions about what they should disclose. And one, sort of nice young man raised his hand and said, well, I'm only supposed to disclose funding I get from the US. And I said, no. You have to disclose every single dollar of funding that you get from every source. And so part of this is education. The universities need to have best practices in place. And in fact, the AAU developed some best practices, and those are on our website if anyone would like to look at them. But you have to have controls, you have to ask questions, you have to make sure that your faculty are disclosing every single piece of their funding. We had to have good relationships with the FBI. And before this really rose in the last few years, AAU had no relationship with the FBI. And so we started that relationship. Toby Smith, who's the vice president for policy at AAU, has created, a really good relationship. And we were critical of the FBI too. We said, look, if you don't tell us what's going on, if you can't share with us, even if it's confidential information, we can keep confidences. Tell us what you're finding. We can use that information to help arm our institutions to do the right thing. And so I'm very pleased with what's happened with that conversation, because there's now an ongoing dialogue. Universities should establish relationships with their local FBI offices, trusting relationships that they'll talk to each other. And this is all in the, I don't think the FBI wants to shut down all international collaborations. They're worried about things that they need to be worried about, but we need to be able to talk to each other. And I think we can come to a better understanding about how to manage this. Are there risks? Sure. There will always be risks.
If I can just ask two follow-up questions, if
Sure.
you and Stephanie will indulge me. One is about the both administrative and sort of cultural burden on universities that sort of new approach is going to require, because traditionally I think you've had maybe one person who has multiple compliance responsibilities. What you're just talking about sounds like you're going to need a whole team of people working on this. That's going to be a
Sure.
new burden on universities. And then there's a sort of related point about the cultural dimension of, independent academics who don't really want to be monitored. Both my brother and sister are academics, and so I have some sense of this. So that's a sort of administrative challenge as well for a university head. How do you get the teachers to comply with the rules, as it were?
No,
I don't mean with the rule. I mean not with the Syria, but just to sort of follow those procedures.
Thank you so much
No,
for joining us.
this you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a challenge, I think, for everybody. I think what we have urged institutions is to not, sort of view every single international student as a threat. Don't view every single international faculty visitor as a threat. I mean, obviously we don't want to do that, but I use this term constructive vigilance. Because I think you have to weigh the risk. You have to have good procedures in place, and if you have procedures that require disclosure, and faculty, something goes wrong and they haven't disclosed, at least you've got a legal ground to stand on. You had a rule, and you ask people to sign that they have followed the rules. This is another administrative burden, and it's one happening at a time when all of the sources of revenue for universities are under pressure. You all know the states are not getting the revenue because of the pandemic, so their contribution to university funding is going to be down. Students are not coming or deferring because they want to wait out the pandemic. Some of the freshmen revenues are down because of that. Some students are upset that tuitions are, not drastically slashed because they're online. In all aspects, this is probably the most challenging time financially that I've ever seen in higher education.
Like, Stephanie, if I could just ask a slightly different variation on this theme. I mean, what about the Chinese students themselves? I mean, you have hundreds of thousands, and
Yes.
they've been, coming with expectations of
Sure.
learning and
Sure.
participating in university life. Now you've got the combination of the COVID effect that a lot of things are virtual. You have, frankly, on the Chinese side, some tightening down on control, which and what they can do. So they're sort of at risk, particularly in this virtual world. And then on our end, we're making it uncomfortable with visa restrictions and some of this monitoring and so forth. The Chinese students are such an important part of your business model, the business model of universities, beyond the sort of moral, ethical, social, other international relations dimensions of this problem. This is a big issue, isn't it? If the students are scared away, as it were.
It's a huge issue, and we've worried about this for really the last few years as sort of the anti-immigration dialogue and has gone on in the United States because we have attracted fabulous Chinese students, and regardless of whether they stay in the U.S. and start businesses and help our economy, or they go home with an understanding of what it's like to live in a free society. I mean, these are all accrued to the benefit of the United States. And so I worry about it because there are alternatives for these students now. Canada is recruiting Chinese students aggressively, so is Australia. Some of the European countries are recruiting them aggressively. And so, we may have to fight for these students. And I hope that we come to a place where, we can offer effective education for these students. We can welcome these students, but we're not going to be naive about the possibility, that some will come with nefarious sort of ideas or instructions or whatever. And we have to be realistic about that. There will always be a risk. I don't think the risk is huge. I didn't view, and particularly at the undergraduate level, because most Chinese undergraduates don't ever get close to any kind of research activity that is highly, valuable and could be taken away. Graduate students are different, and so you have to have rules for graduate students. But Chinese graduate students have been enormously important to this country. So I think we're all trying to find our way through it. And I know that administrators at most research institutions are really working on this every day.
Stephanie, I don't know if you have a follow-up on this or other topics, or we can start going to audience questions as well soon.
I do have a follow-up that kind of weaves together a couple of the last topics that Mary Sue hit on. So I hear from you, and it's my understanding as well, that the benefits that the U.S. has from attracting foreign talent outweighs the risk of that. But it does require, as you were saying, mechanisms to educate faculty on what their obligations are and to preserve research integrity, and also the resources when there are few bad actors, the resources to identify those bad actors. In addition to that, we've seen a lot of reporting recently on kind of cyber vulnerabilities. There's a lot in the papers now about kind of the vaccine race. And so the question goes back to your point on constraints and financing that the universities are facing. Do they have the resources that are needed to prevent leakage of sensitive information, to identify where there are these vulnerabilities, including in the cyber realm? That sounds like it would be a very expensive undertaking, but I'm wondering, are universities equipped to really take that on?
Well, they are certainly trying, and particularly the research-intensive universities. I mean, all the presidents that I know who, host hundreds of millions of dollars worth of research are very attuned to these issues, and are doing their best. I mean, is it a stressful time? It is a very stressful time, and particularly at those institutions that have large medical systems, health systems, hospitals. When you think about just what happened during the pandemic, when all surgeries, elective surgeries were stopped, I mean, our university academic medical centers were losing hundreds of millions of dollars. So this is going to be very tough. And I have faith. I guess I have to have faith in the quality of leadership that we have at these institutions, that they're going to find a way to meet their responsibilities. But this notion that, universities should be slashing their tuition, I mean, they have sunk costs as well as any other entity. They can't do that and still survive. So the next couple of years are going to be really difficult.
Right. We'll go, I think, to audience questions at that point. I mean, this is another recurring theme from many of our episodes, is kind of appreciating the fact. I think we've gotten past the hopeful notion that we would be back to normal in a relatively short amount of time, but it is kind of breathtaking across so many different areas and sectors, higher education among them, that we're going to be living with the legacies of this moment for a long time to come.
We do have some good questions. I some of them is ground that we've covered about, Chinese students, about, about the administrative issues and so forth. Actually, there's one here, Stephanie, if I can throw in the hopper here, which is, it goes back to the first discussion you were having with Mary Sue, but, what will be the new normal of post-COVID-19 in the higher education as the movement of people is curtailed, and how the production of knowledge and research be carried out without direct contact? And I guess if you could talk a little bit more about the sort of pedagogical side of this story, and how this is really going to affect teaching and learning, even if we get back to a sort of more normal situation.
So what's been really interesting to me is I've watched very closely what some of the research laboratories have done, and particularly in the early phases of the pandemic, when they just shut everything down unless it was related to COVID-19 research itself. I mean, this was just devastating. But slowly they brought things back by putting the researchers in shifts. So the labs were running 24-hour shifts, alternate days, so that they could de-densify the areas and clean in between. And amazingly to me, for a number after a few months, they got things back up and running. And the fact that graduate students were willing to come in between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. to get their work done. I just thought, what a great human spirit that is, that people adapted. So they're learning how to do it. They're learning how to deep clean. I think what we're going to see in the future is a lot more sort of scenario planning for something that might happen like this in the future. Who thought about a pandemic? 2 years ago, nobody would have even thought to plan for it. I think we're thinking about it now. I think people are the whole idea of lab design, I think, is going to be modified. People are, particularly if they're renovating buildings, laboratory buildings, or building new ones, are going to think about, okay, how could we segregate if we needed to? It's a whole new sort of area for us. The same might be true of classrooms, that we might think about. How do we modify? If we had to go to something like this, what would we do? Can we be more intentional about the way that we design? What about dormitory spaces? We've been building residence halls the same way for years and years and years. Do we want to do it the same way in the future? Maybe not. In the sort of classroom setting, are there some things that work pretty well on Zoom? I can see you all. This is so much better than having to have a conference call, because I think we can get cues from each other from our facial recognition and sort of when we want to talk. So are there, could you extend in some of your help session with your students to have a Zoom session with 10 students or 20 students, and you could go over the material? That might be something added to the regular in-person format that would be very helpful, because it sort of takes away the time and space limitations of scheduling classrooms if you're going to do it in this format. I wouldn't want to use this as the only format, but it might be an ancillary that we could have some very creative ways to interact that I think students might enjoy and I think faculty might enjoy, if it's not kind of everything. So as I said earlier, I don't see physical campuses disappearing. I think they do so much more than simply educate undergraduate students, which is sort of the way we always think about the higher education. That I view that, perhaps some of the weaker ones will merge or sort of close their doors. That doesn't seem to be happening in huge waves, that's for sure. But I do think that this period will change the way we think about the future.
If I could maybe merge a few questions that we're getting a lot of questions again on this question of the response to foreign students, and in particular Chinese students, what it means for the financial models of many universities. If I could merge that with a broader kind of overriding question, which has to do with where we are currently and kind of the balance between the security, national security risks and preserving the openness of our economy, of our academic environment. So kind of maybe, where are we in that balance? Have we kind of gone too far in the direction of restricting, or is that really just a necessary place for us to be right now, given the risks?
Well, I think a lot will depend on what shakes out, with our immigration policy. We were quite alarmed with sort of blanket restrictions, and particularly we're worried about particularly Chinese students who are here already are afraid to go home because they're afraid that for vacation or to see their families, they're afraid they can't get back in the country because of visa restrictions. So I would hope that we would have a more careful conversation about, what we really need to be worried about, and simply not saying we're not going to let in any Chinese students. This is a disaster for higher education in the US. And one of the reasons is that, I've heard people say, well, I'll just recruit from other countries. The problem is that we have well-established connections with Chinese universities. We understand how the students are prepared before they come to the US. We understand the quality of education that they get. So we can't just go to country X and say, well, we can't recruit from China anymore. Let's recruit from this institution, because we don't have the same kind of connections, and we don't have the same kind of knowledge, and we don't have the same sort of, I don't want to call it a pipeline because I think that's the wrong terminology, but we have a long history of this kind of back and forth with some countries and not with others. And to develop those relationships takes time. Should we be doing it? Yes. Are there areas in South America that we should look to for potential? Because we want the best and brightest from everywhere. We don't have just a single country, but it does take time, and that's what I think our international relations people will be thinking about on university campuses, and our admissions people will be thinking about in the future. How do we plan for that, and what do we do?
Let me also merge a couple of questions. You've touched a little bit on inclusiveness and STEM and so forth, so I think these are related to that. Two different takes on inclusion. One, what will be the impact of COVID-19 on students from low socioeconomic status? So presumably meaning, both students coming in to universities and students already in universities, and the impact on them. The other question, which is, I hope I'm interpreting correctly, is in conducting research, I think especially sort of sociological studies and so forth, you use a pool of people to look at. And this questioner seems to be concerned about, in the virtual world where you don't have the same access to people, or people may not have the same access to these studies and so forth, is that going to affect is there going to create some bias in research, unintended, but just because of the result of this sort of disrupted world that we're in?
I think it could, and I think that's a very valid concern, because as both of you know, a lot of studies that are done, sociology studies, public opinion, just where we need social science research to get to people and have interaction with people. If they don't have the ability to be connected, they don't have a computer, they have to go to a library, whatever. Yes, that's a very big concern that I think we need to be thinking about, and I know that our researchers are thinking about. In terms of how is the COVID-19 going to affect low-income students and low-income families, yes, this is a big worry. And I have felt so sorry for admissions officers at universities because they haven't been able to go out and do their college fairs. I know when I was both at Michigan and Iowa, those admissions offices made really strong attempts to go to rural schools, to areas where there maybe not a lot of students were thinking about coming to a Research One university. And the personal interaction that they had by going to the high school, meeting with the counselor, talking to the kids, this gave the students and the families confidence that they could send their son or daughter away to a school that was going to really give them a great shot at a wonderful life. And so this is hard. And I don't know what the effect is going to be, but I think we're in for a rough time with this, and I hope that we find ways to get to these students, because I felt one of the most important jobs of great universities that I've been at was giving that opportunity to first generation students to come, and we saw what happened if one of those students was educated. What happened to their children and their grandchildren. The social capital that you derive from that kind of access is immeasurable.
Stephanie, I think we can take one more and then we'll have to wrap up.
Sure, yeah, and actually I'm grateful for the focus on the inequality issue in this discussion. It's another theme that keeps coming across in a number of our episodes, and we will actually have a dedicated episode specifically on the issue of inequality. I guess there's kind of a pointed question on this last point, which is acknowledging COVID-19 is a really extraordinary event and then asking if universities should be actually drawing on their endowments at this point to help weather the storm.
Sure. So this is a hard question. And, I certainly dealt with it during the Great Recession when I was at Michigan, 2008, 2009. And, one of the things that we were able to do and do very, very effectively is really ramp up our philanthropy and particularly to let our donors know about particular problems that we had. So, people criticize endowments all the time and why don't you spend them down? I mean, the problem is that the endowment is supposed to last forever. The horizon is infinite. And if you do and we used to do the modeling, and if you really change your payout rates drastically, your endowment will be whittled away within a few decades. It's just a fact that happens. So will some institutions change their payout, to try to accommodate to this? Yes, I'm sure they will. I think also, but they can't do it too much because they threaten the whole institution, and particularly private institutions that depend on their endowments more than public. Public, though, now are beginning to depend on endowments almost as much as private because their state funding has gone down. So that's a very difficult issue. I know that a lot of investment managers and endowment managers are really grappling with that. But I also believe that, one of the things that we found is if you can give your donors an array of possibilities, particularly student needs during the time of the pandemic, that at least during the Great Recession, my experience was that donors really stepped up. And I hope that they will now. But again, this is just going to be a tough time for everybody.
Tough time, yes. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. We could have gone on for hours. It's been a terrific discussion, and we really appreciate your joining us, Mary Sue. Thank you for this and for your work supporting higher education for many years and with different hats on. Really important contribution. So thank you for that. And please, everyone, stay tuned for the Bottom Line segment. But for now, let me just thank you, Mary Sue, for coming on today.
Thank you.
All right. So now we're going to switch to our regular segment, The Bottom Line, where we look at another aspect of disruption. Actually, this one's related. Our research assistant, Dylan Gerstel, is going to talk about pick up on this theme of STEM education, the importance of that for U.S. innovation, and also the inclusive dimensions of that or shortcomings in that regard. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dylan for the Bottom Line. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.
U.S. policymakers are increasingly worried about technology competition with China. In response, politicians on both sides of the aisle have called for more active government efforts to support domestic production and innovation. Many proposals have focused on increasing federal funding of research and development, which has declined as a share of GDP since the 1960s. However, federal R&D spending is only part of the solution. A successful innovation strategy requires a robust and inclusive science and technology talent pipeline. In 2018, the United States spent the fourth most on primary and secondary education per student out of 35 advanced economies, but only achieved average rankings on science and mathematics assessments. The United States also has a significant achievement gap by race and socioeconomic status, which expands as students get older. In a national cohort of students, the mathematics score gap between high and low socioeconomic backgrounds rose from 9 points in kindergarten to 29 points in 8th grade. Gaps between white and Black or Hispanic students showed similar patterns. COVID-19 may widen educational outcome gaps as some students have limited access to quality remote learning resources. Beyond the classroom, policymakers and business leaders should focus on attracting and retaining more women and underrepresented minorities in science and technology professions. Women made up 52% of the U.S. population in 2017, but only held 29% of science and engineering jobs. Between 1993 and 2017, the share of women in computer science and mathematics professions declined from 31% to 27%. Workers from Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous communities accounted for an even smaller share of science and engineering jobs. Individuals from these groups held 13% of science and engineering jobs in 2017, despite representing 28% of the national population. While the percentage of underrepresented minorities in science and engineering occupations has more than doubled since 1995, more action is clearly necessary. As U.S. policymakers support innovation, they should prioritize improving science and technology educational outcomes and workforce inclusiveness. For more from CSIS Economics on U.S. economic competitiveness, visit csis.org/economics.